I don't know if you remember when you were a kid and in school, and maybe some teachers in the room know what I'm going to be talking about here. There was a game we used to play called Follow the Leader, right? And we know it was a secret little game they had to make sure we were quiet in the hallways and we were good because it was for our teacher's sake, right? We knew that it was so that they could make it through the hallways to the next place. And they needed us to keep it together. But there was always somebody in the line who could not keep it together. For one reason or another. I'm not saying I was this person. Maybe I had moments where following the leader was a little tougher some days than others. I believe there are probably some of us who follow a little bit easier than others. We see it. I myself, sometimes, even to this day, when it comes to following, struggle. Like, I got to go on a trip to New York City several years ago, my wife and I, with a couple of friends of ours. And I'm telling you, I had never been to New York City. I was so pumped to be in New York City, to see all the sights, to see the buildings, the hustle and the bustle, and the energy of that city. I know people give New York City a hard time, but I loved it. And we were walking along, and I don't know what happened. I might have gotten carried away with everything and was just so enthralled with what I was seeing, and I followed somebody. And before I knew it, I turned around and like half a block back were my friends and Becky, my wife. And I was getting the look like, what are you doing, man? Instead of following our friends and sticking together and paying attention to our list of things to see, I wanted to see it all. Following the leader. You know, I was thinking about this idea of what it means to follow, and the truth is, in order to follow, you've got to give up being in the lead. And over the next several weeks, as we go through this Lenten season, we're going to look at what it means to follow Jesus. This season of Lent, this 40 days leading up to Easter that do not include Sundays. It takes us through all the way to what's called Holy Week. And on Palm Sunday, we're going to have a night of worship on Palm Sunday in here at 5 o'clock. And then as the week unfolds, we're going to have a special live stream broadcast where we're going to discuss the Last Supper of Jesus on Monday, Thursday of that week. And then out there at the foot of the cross, we'll have a special Good Friday service. And so Lent leads us all the way through that week, that what's called Holy Week. Ultimately leading us to Good Friday, where we recognize Jesus' death on the cross and what the cross means and why it's so important. And so we're going to look at these different moments in Jesus' ministry when he called people to follow him, ultimately following him to the cross. And in Matthew chapter 16, the first book in the New Testament, Jesus gives a very straightforward declaration of what it means to follow him. When he tells a large crowd that was gathered around him, he says, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. Give up our own way. See, when you give something up, like Jesus is saying here, to give up your own way and take up the cross means to exchange our way for the way of Jesus. So over these next several weeks, we're going to unpack that more and more as we get closer and closer to Good Friday. But this whole idea of our own way that leads us from God, where we can easily ignore God, our own way that leads others away from God, the lives that we influence, our own way leads us to a death absent of God. But Jesus is calling us. He calls his followers to lay down their own ways and follow him. To be willing to take up our cross, he says, and we'll unpack that more. To take up our cross and follow Jesus. And to trust because we know Jesus. We've seen what Jesus has experienced. We know what happens after the cross. And so we can trust that we will be revived by the cross. That the cross we bear for following Jesus will not be the end of us. And believing and trusting that on the other side of the cross is life. We know this. It's kind of interesting because when we get to this season of Lent and the Holy Week, and we know how the story goes. Jesus has shown us that the cross isn't the end. But it begins with following. Following Jesus when he calls us. Following Jesus, the Jesus that we learn about in the Bible, who is revealed to us through the power of God's Holy Spirit. And listen, here's the main point for the day as we begin this series. Following Jesus revives our purpose. Following Jesus revives within us what we were created for. We were created to be in relationship with God. And that relationship impacts our relationships with others. That's what we have been created for. And we actually have a part to play. We actually have a part to play in helping others to hear the same voice of Jesus calling them to follow him. It's a purpose that is deep within us. And Jesus speaks to this very deep part of us. He does this, and he does this right out the gate when he calls his very first disciples. And we're going to look in Matthew chapter 4 at this first scene of when he calls the first disciples. Chapter 4, verses 18 through 22. It's going to be on the screen if you want to follow along. Now, listen, you're going to have to stay with me because there's going to be moments. If you're new today, there are going to be moments that I ask people to read with me, so you got to stick with me, okay? Here we go. One day, as Jesus was walking along the shore of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Say, fished for a living. Ready? Fished for a living. Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." Say, fish for people. Ready? Fish for people. Oh, you guys are good. And they left their nets at once and followed him. A little farther up the shore, he saw two other brothers, James and John, sitting in a boat with their father Zebedee, repairing their nets. And he called to them, "Come too." They immediately followed him, leaving the boat and their father behind. Now here's some background to this story. This story, you can find it overlapping in other gospels, those first four books of the New Testament. If you go to the book of John in chapter 1, you'll actually see this. There's a little bit more to this story. John the Baptist, who is Jesus' cousin, the one who was preparing everybody and getting them ready for the arrival of the Messiah, the one who is trying to get people ready to see who Jesus is and to be ready for when Jesus shows up. One day he's preaching and he sees Jesus walking toward him. So everybody who's listening to John the Baptist hear him say to them, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." John the Baptist is already pointing this out, pointing people toward Jesus. And so some of John the Baptist's disciples want to know more about this Jesus guy. So they start to follow and see where he goes. One of those disciples is named Andrew. And they actually go and see where Jesus is staying, and they go to his camp out, right? And they get there. And Andrew then goes and tells his brother Peter about who he's found. And it's interesting, you get this sense that everybody in the scene, they're looking for the Messiah. Andrew has been looking for the Messiah, so he goes and tells his brother Simon. Apparently, Simon Peter, has also been looking for the Messiah. I found this quote really interesting. This is from N.T. Wright, one of my favorite theologians. He says, what Andrew and Simon Peter thought they were doing was looking for the Messiah. What they didn't realize was that the Messiah was looking for them. The Messiah was looking for them. This wasn't just a chance meeting with Jesus and Peter and his brother Andrew. This didn't just happen by accident. But we're not done, because there's another scene in the book of Luke that gives us even some more detail about what happens when Andrew and Peter actually are called by Jesus to follow him. Once again, in Luke chapter 5, Jesus is preaching and teaching to a crowd, and he's on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, I was reading a little bit about what the ground was like there, right? It was kind of hilly, and the hill goes up the side from the Sea of Galilee. And when you're standing on shore and you're talking to somebody, wind blowing, everything like that, it's hard to really understand what someone's saying. So Jesus sees a boat that's there. And he uses this boat. Guess whose boat it was? It's Peter's boat. And he goes out from shore just a little bit, because apparently this is the way it is even today, you can get out just a little way from the shore and you can talk in a normal voice and people can hear you very, very clearly. And Jesus teaches. And when they get done, they come back into shore. Now again, if we looked at what we've already learned here, Peter and Andrew know some of the backstory to who Jesus is. They've heard about him through John the Baptist. So Peter has a profound respect already for Jesus. But listen to what happens. This is in Luke chapter 5, starting in verse 4. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, Peter, now go out where it's deeper and let down your nets to catch some fish. Now, here's Peter's reply, right? We worked hard all night last night and didn't catch a thing. But if you say so, remember he's got this respect for Jesus already, I'll let the nets down again. It says, and this time, their nets were so full of fish, they began to tear. A shout for help brought their partners in the other boat, and soon both boats were filled with fish and on the verge of sinking. When Simon Peter realized what had happened, listen to what he does here. When he realized what happened, he fell to his knees before Jesus and said, "O Lord, please leave me. I'm such a sinful man." For he was awestruck by the number of fish they had caught, as were the others with him. His partners, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were also amazed. And Jesus replied to Simon. I love this. This is what Jesus replies to Peter's posture toward him. Don't be afraid. Say that with me. Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be fishing for people. And as soon as they landed, they left everything and followed Jesus. I was looking up some of this, and I actually came across, apparently several years ago, the Sea of Galilee had dried up so much that it uncovered this boat that had been stuck in the mud down in like the seabed of the Sea of Galilee. And they actually raised it from the seabed and preserved as much as they could. And then they did carbon dating. It actually was from the time of Jesus. So they found this boat. It's interesting when I think about the livelihood of these fishermen, Andrew and Peter and the sons of Zebedee, James and John. This was their livelihood. This is what brought stability to their family. Fishing. And it's interesting, fishing, and particularly in that age, would probably be pretty much a middle class type of salary and cost of living and all that goes into that. That pretty much is what they would be experiencing. Especially in a community, in a town that had a military presence, everybody was going to need some fish. It was a stable income. This is what they knew. This is what they were good at. And now, Jesus, this man, this preacher, this rabbi, steps right into the middle of their everyday lives. It's interesting. It's interesting to me because just like that quote, they thought they were looking, but instead he was looking for them. And he comes and he meets them there. Listen here, Jesus meets us where we are. He meets us where we are. I knew this for myself. I experienced this even for myself. I grew up in the church. I'd been raised in the church. As a kid, I had learned about Jesus. I had even at times prayed the prayer of giving my life to Jesus. But I'm going to tell you where I really sensed the voice of God calling me was when I was in middle school. And I remember we would have these things called revivals, and they would be like week-long revivals, Monday through Friday. Sometimes they started on Sunday night. And every night we would come, and sometimes we'd have a meal together, and then we'd have a service. And I remember this guy who was preaching about giving your whole life to Jesus and following Jesus, saying yes to Jesus. And something in my mind and in my heart clicked where I was like, I want this more for myself. I don't want to just be dependent on my parents' understanding of faith and of Jesus. And I felt a very, very real call of Jesus to come and follow him with my whole life. And so I said yes in middle school. I'm telling you right now, it's a really good reminder. Parents, for your kids, they're never too young to hear about Jesus. They're never too young to say yes to Jesus. Teenagers, you are never too young to give your life to Jesus and follow him. You're never too young to begin to say yes. And I'm going to tell you why. Because Jesus meets you right where you are. He's looking for you. He wants to speak to your heart. Well, back to Matthew chapter 4. Jesus called out to them. Andrew and Peter, come follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people. Fish for people. It's interesting what Jesus would use this language. I love it because Jesus used a language that would speak to their hearts. He knew who he was talking to. He knew that they would understand what it meant to go fishing. He knew that they would understand that whole concept of fishing. But can you imagine hearing him say, fishing for people? I don't know that they actually understood the full on what he meant by that. It probably took them by surprise just a little bit. What they did know is from the experience that they had just had, where they caught more fish, probably than they'd ever have caught, maybe even would have caught in their lifetime. They knew they wanted to be a part of whatever it was that this rabbi was up to. And now they saw with their own eyes. It's interesting, if you look back at the text there in Luke, after that incredible moment where they had so many fish that their boat was sinking, and they brought in another boat and it was on the verge of sinking too. After they'd been up all night and they hadn't caught anything. In fact, Peter's response, did you catch his initial response in the book of Luke when we were looking at the details? When he experienced Jesus like that, did you see what he said? His first response was, "Oh Lord, please leave me. I'm such a sinful man." In that moment, in that experience that Peter was having with Jesus, it was such an overwhelming experience. It was such a holy moment that immediately Peter began to know that he couldn't stand up under the pressure. The only thing he could do was to confess. And Peter was right, because on his own power and in his own strength, he was lost in his sinfulness. But I love what the book of Luke writes. I love how Luke writes about this whole encounter. Because even after he makes this confession, even after he realizes that he doesn't measure up, I want to tell you something. The enemy of God, the enemy of our souls, wants us to live in fear of God. The enemy wants us to think that our brokenness is too broken for God to love us. Or that we have such a fear of fully trusting God with everything. That if we really trust God, then we won't be in control of it all. To fully trust God with everything, with our lives, with our families, with our careers, with our finances, with our futures. Maybe that's what flashed in front of Peter's eyes, right? Do you ever have those moments where you catch a glimpse and you think, whoa? And I feel like Peter was having one of these moments where Jesus didn't even have to say anything else. He knew that just by being in Jesus' presence, there was something that Jesus was drawing out of him. Isn't that awesome? Something that Jesus was drawing out of him. And I love it because in Luke, if we read these details, when Peter confesses this, Jesus doesn't say, "You're right, Peter. Go get your act together and then come follow me." It's not what he says. Do you remember what he says? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Come follow me. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid that God isn't capable of taking care of you. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to trust God with your future. Don't be afraid. But he doesn't just meet us where we are. There's also something else here that we cannot miss. When Jesus calls us, when he meets us where we are, one of the things he wants to do with our lives is he wants to meet other people where they are through us. He says to them, "I will show you how to fish for people. I will show you how to fish for people." Now, we find out what fishing for people looks like when we look at the ministry and the life of Jesus. As we read the stories of what Jesus did and how he taught his disciples, Jesus, he shows these disciples how to have compassion. He shows them how to see people. He shows them how to bring healing to other people's lives. He shows them how to help other people see who he is. And all of this is preparing his disciples for a life after the cross. Because I'm going to tell you something, when the time comes, when the moment of the cross comes, they are going to have to keep following. Even when they weren't really sure what was next. And let me tell you, for Peter, the one who has this experience with Jesus, he has a rough go of it. In fact, as we get closer to the cross and Jesus' last night before he dies, when Jesus is arrested, it's Peter who acts like he doesn't even know who Jesus is. When he is questioned, do you know this guy? Have you hung out with? I thought you hung out with this guy. He said, no, I don't know him. 3 times Peter pretended he didn't even know who Jesus was. In the darkest, lowest moment, this same Peter forgot he wasn't supposed to be afraid. But once again, just like in Jesus' fashion, he meets Peter where he is. There's a scene at the very end of the book of John, chapter 21. There's a scene after Jesus has been raised from the dead. A few days after it, some of Jesus' disciples had gathered once again on the shore of that Sea of Galilee. And it's in the morning hours. And once again, Peter's doing what Peter loves to do. Listen to what it says. This is chapter 21, starting in verse 3. Simon Peter said to these buddies and these friends of his, other disciples, I'm going fishing. We'll come too, they all said. So they went out in the boat. Well, listen to what happened next. But they caught nothing all night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. And he called out, fellas, have you caught any fish? I love this translation, by the way. I love that word, fellas. An old friend calling out to them. No, they replied. Then he said, throw out your net on the right hand side of the boat, and you'll get some. So they did. And they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. An aha moment after this happens. John, one of the sons of Zebedee, recognizes it's Jesus. And Peter, who's been in the boat with him, man, like he doesn't even wait a second, jumps and goes and takes off to the shore. And the way the rest of the story goes is eventually the rest of the crowd, the rest of the crew gets up to the shoreline, and those disciples and Jesus, they have breakfast together, and they have some of that fish for breakfast. I don't like fish for breakfast, but that's okay. They have fish for breakfast, and then they have this really awesome conversation. And once again, the conversation kind of focuses down between Peter and Jesus. And so Jesus is talking to Peter, and he begins to ask Peter some questions. And 3 times, just like the 3 times where Peter had denied him, 3 times Jesus asked him, do you love me? First time, Peter's like, yeah, of course I do, Jesus. And so Jesus says, well, then feed my sheep. We go from fish to sheep now. Jesus asks him a second time, he says, do you love me? And Peter says, he's getting a little bothered by it, but he's okay. He's like, yes, Jesus, I love you, of course. And Jesus says, well, then tend my sheep. One more time, Jesus asks him, Simon Peter, do you love me? And Peter is frustrated at this point a little bit more. Of course, Jesus, I love you. And Jesus says, well, then feed my sheep. It's interesting because all along the way, Jesus has been showing him how to fish for people, right? We go from fish now to sheep, and they're both representations of people. And all along the way, Jesus has been showing Peter how to care for people, how to love people, how to reach people, how to help people see Jesus. And then the conversation, it turns into this really interesting thing where Jesus talks about how Peter's life will look toward the end of his life, indicating how Peter's last days will be lived out. Do you know what the two words are, though, after he gets done with this conversation is? Two words. Follow me. Follow me. Fishing for people. Feeding. Caring. All of it comes back to following Jesus. Here, listen up. Following Jesus is for the sake of others. Following Jesus is for the sake of others. Our faith in Jesus is not meant to be built around ourselves. We follow with a purpose. We follow to help others follow. In fact, at the end of the book of Matthew, in what's called the Great Commission, Jesus says to his disciples, go and make disciples. We are supposed to be going and living and helping others to follow Jesus. We are followers who help other people become followers. It is part of what it means to follow Jesus. Because we want people to know and experience his love and his goodness and his healing that he can bring into the deepest parts of our lives. Following Jesus is for the sake of others. Now, let's talk about this, following Jesus. Does it mean that tomorrow you should turn in your resignation at your job? I don't know. Maybe what it means is that you're supposed to follow Jesus right where you are. That you follow Jesus in such a way that your life is impacting the people you work with. That you're following Jesus in such a way that the people that you go to school with, the people you hang out with, the people in your home. That you help them to see and experience Jesus through your life. God has a purpose for each one of us. We're to follow Jesus, to learn about Jesus. I will tell you right now, I'm going to give you a warning that we do need to watch out for voices and others, distractions that lead us away from Jesus. We must keep our eyes on the Jesus that we learn about in the scriptures, the Jesus that the Holy Spirit of God helps us to hear his voice through his words. So today we hear him calling to us to follow him. Because following Jesus revives our purpose. Following Jesus revives our purpose. I'm going to ask you to stand. I have some questions for you I want us to reflect on here as we wrap up this morning. Number one, what do you need to leave behind today to follow Jesus? What do you need to leave behind today to follow Jesus? Number two, are you following Jesus for the sake of others? In other words, maybe your faith walk has become too absorbed in you. Maybe your own agenda is getting in the way of you following Jesus to help others to follow him. Lastly, this is what I want us to really focus on today. What's getting in the way of you fully trusting Jesus with your life, with your whole life, right? Trusting Jesus with your future, trusting Jesus with your career, trusting Jesus with your family, trusting Jesus with your marriage, trusting Jesus at school, trusting Jesus with your grades, trusting Jesus for your future. What's getting in the way? What do you need to lay down? Maybe you need to hear the words of Jesus again that says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Come, follow me. Would you bow your heads? Let's begin with this. I want to give you a chance, if you haven't, or if you want to recommit your life, to give your life to Jesus. It's a simple prayer that I lead us in every single week, that we use every single week, and it is so simple, but I believe that it gets right to the point. And you can whisper this prayer out loud, you can whisper it in your heart. But it goes like this. Jesus, I give you my life. I confess my selfish sins, and I ask for forgiveness. Jesus, I trust that you do forgive me. And I accept and I receive your love for me. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.